Uh, you're recording me, Mike. How our young people recover after experiencing some of those challenging situations. And everyone talks about resilience, and yes, resilience is a wonderful thing, but we have to break some of that down into component parts when we think about how do we structure things like new interventions, how do we appropriately support folks in mental health and just our personal settings and personal lives. From there, we kind of narrowed it down to social support. And then I spent some semesters really thinking about, social support is so many things, trauma is so many things, mental health is so many things. And Mike would not ease up on the Rob, you got to focus this a little bit. So it's kind of how we landed where we are. So my dissertation and my focus has been on the relationship between trauma and internalizing symptoms, depression and anxiety, and the role that supportive behaviors and supportive people in our lives shapes that relationship. I specifically focused on parental support, but looking at parental support more broadly, knowing that a lot of the young people I engage with look at different people as that parental figure in their lives. So here's our agenda for the next 45 or so minutes. We'll talk a little bit about the background, the structure, and the research that I did, the findings. We'll look at the implication, some of the limitations that I experienced, and some directions that moving forward with research, really some what I find interesting ways to apply some of what I've learned and how to continue to expand on some of what I've learned. So the purpose of this dissertation, as I've already mentioned, is to explore the influence of specific supportive relationships, the internalizing symptoms of emerging adults exposed to community violence. So when we look at community violence, we look at that as a form of trauma. So trauma in itself, this is the SAMHSA definition of trauma. So someone exposed to death, threats of death, actual or perceived sexual violence. I look at it a little bit more broadly. We can look at vicarious trauma. So the trauma that we hear about happening to other people, especially when we look at clinicians and first responders. We also look at things like community violence. I don't have to see or witness violence in my community to know about it. I might hear gunshots or fighting in the streets. I might hear those police sirens on an ongoing basis, and that in and of itself for people can be traumatic. And it can be, it's this ongoing trauma that we're exposed to as well. So how do the supportive relationships that we engage in help us to work through some of this trauma? When we look at a more specific definition of community violence, that's the violence that occurs in our environment, but not in our home, and between or among individuals who are not members of the same family. It helps us break out some of the domestic violence that in and of itself is traumatic, some of the child abuse and neglect that we witness and know about happening to those that we engage with and those that we work with. So there are a number of risk factors, and I've just summarized a few of the risk factors for community violence as a traumatic experience. So some of those risk factors in a community are high levels of unemployment and poverty, decreased folks disengaged in their community, poor housing, lack of access to healthcare. All of these things contribute to communities of people experiencing heightened levels of community violence. And when you look at the research and what researchers have identified as some of the protective factors, what prevents individuals and communities from being exposed to high levels of community violence. So some of it is just those abundant resources. I have access to employment opportunities. There's places where I can go and feel safe. There's parks in my neighborhood. And that I'm engaged in my community and get some sort of reward for engaging positively with my community. And that can be just simply positive relationships with those I engage in. And then one of the key factors that has been noted in research across the lifespan is that family support from one's family, really works as a buffer against some of the negative experiences of community violence. We also have to talk about emerging adulthood because my research, when I shrunk it down a little bit, I really have an interest in our emerging adults. And our emerging adults typically is that age group between 18 and 29. So you're not really an adolescent anymore. Society itself looks at you as an adult. But at the same time, you're still learning and developing. We know from brain research and studies on adolescent brains, we continue to develop and our brains continue to develop until we're 24, 25, especially our prefrontal cortex that allows us to think through our decisions and reason, weigh the pros and cons. So that in and of itself, for me, indicates and suggests that our young people they're not quite adults. So I specifically looked at the early stages of emerging adulthood, specifically because we do have, with our young people, as they transition to early emerging adulthood, there is an initial withdrawal from our parental figures. We're 18, I got it figured out. Mom, dad, to hell with you. I've got it just fine. But there is a return to these supports as folks age. So research on emerging adults has noted that by late 18, 19, 20 years old, young people are coming back and saying, hey, I need that support. So we know for emerging adulthoods, much like adolescence, there is that need for that strong parental support. And there is a positive association between parental support, again, across the lifespan and well-being. So what are we discussing when we talk about social support? So House in 1981 suggested that these are the four main components of social support. So it's emotional support, being able to talk to someone about how you're feeling and getting that support. Instrumental support, when I need something tangible, a ride to the airport, which I love to ask people for. There's somebody who can give me that ride to the airport. Informational support. With the young people I work with, that's always a form of support I'm giving them. How do I access resources? How do I navigate this system? How do I do my math homework? And then appraisal support. How do I assess or the support that I receive in assessing a situation that I'm experiencing? And we'll talk a little bit when we get to this findings of the first aim and first part of my dissertation that slightly adjust some of these supportive behaviors that are most beneficial. So the theoretical framework around social support is structured around the stress and coping theory, which really it just suggests that support reduces the impact of stressful life experiences on an individual, either through the supportive actions that I receive or the perception and the idea that, hey, if I needed something, there are people that I can go to for support. And there are two models that shape this framework. One is the general benefits model. The other is the stress buffering model. So the general benefits model is just like, hey, whenever you have support, it's good for you. It's great. The other one is that support only really comes into play when we're experiencing a stressful situation. And I will say, which I'll talk about in the limitations section, the research specifically around this theoretical framework is a little bit weak. There isn't a whole lot to really look and dig at. So for my dissertation, broken up into three aims. The first one was developing a depth of support measure, specifically to look at the strength of specific supportive relationships on well-being. So the measurement tools that currently exist look at our social network. So all of the supports that I receive from all of the people in my life. But with my interest on how specific relationships impact the relationship between mental health and well-being, really I wanted to have a tool to really look at how does one individual relationship shape our well-being. Obviously, in developing a measurement tool, have to assess the validity and reliability, which I did in aim 2. And then I applied that, I used that measurement tool in a quantitative application in the third aim. So for my first aim, again, I looked at developing this depth of support measure. So the first step I took, there's again, a lot of different measurement tools that are used to assess our networks, our social networks. So I identified 28 measures. And 12 of those measures were reviewed and included in this initial aim. So some measurement tools I just could not obtain. That just wasn't possible. And several of the measurement tools were qualitative in nature, so were more interview style assessments. And because we're looking at this more quantitatively, I did not include those because of their structure. So I reviewed all of the items from these social support measures, and I organized them according to the 4 social support subconstructs. So there were 169 different items that I looked at, and I selected 7 items from each subconstruct. So within I organized them according to these subconstructs, and then within it, sorted them out and organized them by themes that I saw within the items. For example, when looking at more of that tangible support, some of the measurement tools had items around receiving transportation, some had receiving financial support. So I further organized according to those themes, and then selected 1 item from each of the themes that was generated. I also concurrently wanted to assess, after I selected those measures, the content validity of those items that were selected. So using licensed clinical social workers in the state of Missouri, I reached out to probably 200 folks by email, and 29 folks responded to my request. And what they did was they evaluated, they reviewed all of the items. What was included was 35 items. So what happened was, as I was doing that research and organizing the items along subconstructs, this theme, this additional subconstruct of belonging was very prevalent in most of the assessment tools I looked at. So feeling that sense of belonging, feeling like people accept me for who I am, also rose to the top as a subconstruct. So that was included. There were items included as well for that area. So I had my subject matter experts, the licensed clinical social workers, review all the selected items, and the content validity was assessed using the content validity ratio. So with a sample of 29 people, items scoring a 0.379 were included and retained for the final measurement tool. What I also did during this stage was I had a small set of participants with whom I did qualitative interviews. So these participants were recruited from St. Louis University in Covenant House, Missouri, which is a residential program for young people experiencing homelessness between the ages of 16 and 24, located here in St. Louis. Just some simple demographics. 5 of the participants were white, 6 female. 2 of the participants in this qualitative stage identified as transgender or gender nonconforming, and then 4 of the participants identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. The structure of these qualitative interviews, they were approximately 45 minutes in length, and really just very open-ended questions around the support that individuals received, because I wanted to use that information as well. Our individuals were all experts on support and what makes sense for us and what is supportive to us. And I wanted to include that as I developed and selected the measurement tools. These are just a sample of some of the questions. So tell me about a supportive parental figure in your life who you consider supportive. Tell me about that time when they were supportive. And then tell me in what ways they supported you when you experienced a challenging situation. And again, during this time, I encouraged individuals to identify, they could identify not just a parental figure who was blood related, but if a sibling was viewed as a parental figure to them, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a foster parent, a neighbor, gave them the space to look at exactly who that supportive figure was for them. And then in terms of integrating the two, I didn't have in the research, there wasn't necessarily a framework for bridging those two approaches. So for items that did not score, were not retained through the content validity ratio process, I included items within the measurement tools, within the final measurement tool, that were endorsed by at least 2 participants. And through all of that, what I found is that belonging rose to the top as a very important subconstruct for individuals. They wanted to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of connection to people in their lives. At the same time, informational and instrumental support were eliminated from the measurement tool. Particularly some of well, we'll talk about why in just a moment. And then 4 items ended up being retained for appraisal, emotional, and belonging subconstructs. And then I had it, and I thought, this is great. Got a good measurement tool. And these are just the items that were maintained into the measurement tool that was that is assessed in AIM-2. So in AIM-2, I assessed the validity and reliability of the measurement tool that I created in AIM-1. So participants were recruited from 2 locations. One was Leaders in Training, which is a college access and completion organization based in Las Vegas, and then again also at St. Louis University. I had 28 participants review and pre-test the measurement tool. Due to some errors in the researcher's approach, demographic information was not captured during this part of AIM-2. So participants were presented with the 12 measure items, and were asked to identify items that were confusing. And there was, or if the format and language was confusing with the instructions, there was only one item that participants found a little bit confusing, and that was providing feedback without saying it was good or bad. I'm going to go back just one slide, a couple of slides. So that was the appraisal support. I didn't want to get that wrong. So what I did was then I took a look at the items that were included in the initial item bank created in AIM-1, and found a comparable item that had a little bit more information, that was a little bit more clear. Again, some researcher minor errors is that I didn't go back and then test that item. So that item remained untested and in a pre-testing phase. Then I dove into the validity and reliability testing. And now all of this after I did the qualitative interviews in February 2019. Is that when COVID started? 2020? I don't even remember. So those happened right before COVID, and those were in person. And then subsequently, all the research was online. So my measurement or my surveys were administered online, which we'll talk about the limitations around that a little bit later. So I recruited 59 participants from those 2 locations, and just some brief demographics on those. About 70% identified as female, about 40% Latino, and 22% as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. In testing validity and reliability, I utilized a number of measurement tools for comparison. So for depression, the 9-item patient health questionnaire, the PHQ-9. For anxiety, the generalized anxiety disorder GAD-7, 7-item measurement tool. For social support, the multidimensional scale of perceived social support. Loneliness, the UCLA loneliness scale. Social support, the social support as well, the social provision scale, and then the measurement tool I developed in AIM-1. So for internal consistency, I looked at internal consistency, convergent validity, discriminant validity, and then incremental validity. And all of these were conducted for both depression and anxiety. Both of these were conducted for incremental validity, we looked at social support, depression, and anxiety, along with the depth of support measurement tool. So for internal consistency, reliability, we looked at, or I looked at, it was just me, items. We looked at the correlation between items within each subconstruct, and then between the items across the whole measurement tool. And when you look at the data on what constitutes a good correlation where it's either not related enough or too similar that the measurement items are too similar. There was a little bit of variety in what was considered acceptable. So one was 0.5, 0.15 up to 0.5. Another that I found was 0.25 all the way up to 0.7. So I looked at something that was that fell a little bit in the in-between between those two ranges. So when I looked at the items and how they correlated within each subconstruct and within the items across the measurement tool, 6 items were dropped. And the correlation between the remaining items was between 0.25 and 0.6. When we looked at convergent validity, there was a statistically significant relationship between the multidimensional scale of perceived social support and the depth of support measure. And discriminant validity also showed a statistically significant relationship between the measurement tool and the UCLA loneliness scale. Incremental validity, what you'll see here is that we did find that the depth of support measure added to the predictive relationship when we looked at the relationship between the multidimensional scale of perceived social support and the UCLA loneliness scale. We did see that the predictive value with the addition of the depth of support measure increased slightly. And we'll again talk about, once I get through these, I'll just mention why we'll see that. We saw a little bit more predictive validity increase when we looked at the loneliness and depression. And loneliness and depression. Sorry, the first was social support, looking at social support. The second here was depression, and the third anxiety. And you see considerable gains in the predictive value. So in the first model that I shared, sorry, I'm clicking back and forth. Y'all make me nervous. You're just staring deadpan at me. Jesus. Is this the goal? Mike's sitting back a little. Mike Mancini, you're sitting back a little bit. You're going to hit me with some questions, I can tell. So with the relationship between the UCLA loneliness scale and the multidimensional scale of perceived social support, we only see a slight increase here because really the depth of support measure looks at just a specific relationship. And obviously, if we're looking at my entire supportive network, I'm going to get a little bit more out of that than just an individual relationship. So with that, and through all that assessment, the measurement tool included these 6 items. And the intention here was to develop a measurement tool that was brief in nature, specifically thinking about applying it in a more clinical setting, or just when you're working with individuals or young people and just wanting to do a quick assessment of the support that they receive from a supportive person in their life. All right, so here we go, aim 3. I hope you're all ready. This is some fascinating information, or not. You all read my dissertation, so you know exactly what's happening here. So this is when we applied the measurement tool in a quantitative application. So the hypothesis here was that the depth of parental support will function as a moderator in the relationship between community violence exposure and internalizing symptoms, such that at increased levels of community violence exposure, greater depth of support will be associated with a decreased level of internalizing symptoms. And not to surprise you, but that might not be what was observed. So just some information about the sample. So again, with this sample, because of the limitations in recruitment due to it being all virtual, I continue to use leaders in training as due to the relationship. That's where I continue to source my participants. And these were different participants from those who participated in AIM 2. So we were able to recruit 150 participants. They ranged in age from 18 to 24. Most, due to the nature of their program, most of those who participated had some level of college education, and you can see the other demographic information as well. I will say with this sample, there was very negligible participation from the LGBT community. So in terms of their engagement and their identified parental supportive figure, most identified their most supportive parental figure as their biological mother. And obviously, because that's who you identify, most knew their supportive figure for a very long time and had regular communication with that supportive figure. In terms of other identified persons for the remaining 10 participants not included, that was identified as 2 other groups, and that was grandmothers and older sisters. So in this stage of my research, we had fewer measurement tools that we were using simultaneously. So for mental health, we looked at I utilized the brief symptom inventory, specifically the depression and anxiety subscales. For community violence exposure, we used the community experience questionnaire, sorry. And depth of support, we utilized the measurement tool developed in the earlier aims of the study. So 3 regression models were conducted for internalizing symptoms of depression and anxiety separately. So one looked at community violence and the internalizing symptom. The other added the depth of support measurement tool into the model. And then in the third, we looked at that depth of support. We utilized that as a moderator in the relationship between the 2. So for depression, what we found is that there was, for each additional community violence exposure, there was a significant increase in depression for the sample of about 15%. When you add depth of support into that, I'm going to have to go back and look at this. 14.9, sorry. When you add depth of support in there, you see a slight decrease in that relationship, suggesting that when you have parental support in your life, there's it has some sort of a positive impact. However, when you look at it as a moderator, this research did not find that depth of support functioned as a true moderator in that relationship. And we did the same for anxiety as well, using the brief symptom inventory. So we found that each additional experience of community violence corresponded to an increase in anxiety of 18.4%. And that with the addition of the depth of support measure, we saw a slight increase in the outcome. However, depth of support as a moderator had no impact. So there are, so in terms of, we'll get to the limitations in just a moment. I know we're all interested in those. Why didn't it work out? And, there's some reasons here, but, just in terms of looking at the broad scope of this research, is really for me that belonging becomes that essential component. When you look at research that exists, it talks a lot about, House's original 4 subconstructs of support. And I do think they're all important. Informational and appraisal support, however, require those that we're engaging with, information and that tangible support as well is what I call it, and the instrumental support. They fall off because individuals don't always have the resources to support us, but that doesn't mean their relationship to us is not strong and impactful. They also might not possess the right knowledge to be able to give us the information that we need. Again, it doesn't make their support any less valuable and important to us. And that belonging for individuals can be a really strong and powerful tool for feeling supported. And then, the measurement tool did show some validity and reliability. So hats off to me on picking good items for the measurement tool. Y'all, I want to make so many more jokes and have a good time here, and I'm having trouble not doing that because this is supposed to be a little more professional and serious. I don't really roll with professional and serious. So what are the limitations? Brandy and Mike, shout out to you for saying, hey, there are a lot more limitations to this study. So when I went back and made my edits, we had a lot more. but I appreciate it because it is important to highlight the limitations of our research, especially when we're not able to make all of the, not able to find what we were hoping to find. So obviously the pandemic was a significant limitation. In the original study design, they were to be administered in person. I think, there is you question when things are administered virtually online, the validity and the information that you're receiving. So that obviously created a problem. I also wasn't able to recruit as many individuals as I anticipated for the initial interviews. The very quick onset of the COVID-19 pandemic really impacted the ability to do so. There is, as I mentioned previously, there is not a strong body of research around the theoretical framework for stress and coping theory, which obviously is going to have a little bit of an impact on the research if it's just not there. I also can't leave out the reality that culture does play a part in what we perceive as support, how we engage our supports. And this study did not examine that. I would say that was probably a little bit of some short-sightedness on my part in the original conceptualization. As we mentioned, the online or the virtual sampling, and also how we perceive supportive behaviors is also important to note here as a limitation. How do individuals, even though the aims walked through developing these items and utilizing feedback from individuals, and how we perceive the supportive behaviors of other people does impact how we view the strength of relationships. And again, this research did not explore that. I don't have this on here, but also the racial breakup and gender breakup of the samples. We're not, unfortunately, because of the sampling techniques that I use, I wasn't able to get as diverse a sample as I would have hoped, knowing that different populations are differentially impacted by violence in their communities, whether that's Black African American young men in particular, or members of the LGBTQIA community. So that's important to note here, as well as a limitation. So directions for future research. I really am interested in how belonging really plays out as a form of support. There's not a ton of research, but as I mentioned, most of the measurement tools I looked at included items around this idea of belonging. And then also, doing the same application on different forms of trauma. Maybe that individual parental support is particularly beneficial for folks who've experienced sexual trauma or have experienced natural disasters. And I think that could be important to look at. And then, as well, as I mentioned before, continuing to explore how culture, different cultures perceive support does impact that relationship as well. So thank you. Again, thank you all for your feedback. Thank you for your support in getting this done. I'm happy to be at the final stage, and I am very not excited to receive all your questions. And I'm going to unshare the screen just so I can see all of your faces nice and big. Don't all come at once. I only want the easy questions.
We'll throw you some softballs.
Thanks, Brandy.
Mike, you want to go first, or you want others of us to go first?
Yeah, why don't you, I'll just go last. If anybody wants to jump in, go ahead.
Brandy and Mike Mancini, so you're writing stuff down.
Yeah, because I think of brilliant things at the time, and then I forget them by the time it comes. So I try to write some little scribbling notes down. So first of all, I've really enjoyed reading this and being on this. You took a big project. Coming up with developing your own measure is a huge piece of research that you started, and then you use that to formulate some other questions and look at some other pieces of community violence and support. So hats off to you, especially getting this all done through COVID. It was quite a, you got thrown a lot of barriers to overcome during this whole time. So not only did you kind of bite off a lot, you had to deal with a lot of different things coming at you to get through it. So very good. Also, yeah, there are a lot of limitations, but no study is perfect. So you're not alone. All dissertations have a lot of limitations. So don't worry about that so much. But what I thought was really interesting as I was reading this, and I, made some comments, because with support, instrumental and informational support seem oftentimes very obviously seeming important in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So I was kind of surprised myself when those just got dropped. I'm like, how those just get dropped? But I appreciate a lot of your discussion today, really thinking about and talking about belonging. And I think it really kind of comes back down to the problem that you're looking at in terms of its relationship with support, and looking at community violence and trauma. And you're just thinking about all of these other measures have these other things, but since you were focused on this, the belonging did probably come through as being kind of a more critical piece to those to people. Whereas other problems, that instrumental and informational support would probably perhaps be a little bit more highly valued in that. But
Yeah,
so just in general, so I just thought that was really interesting. And I learned a lot through that, and just kind of thinking through those pieces in terms of specifically your topic that you were looking at as well. But I'm just really curious, because you went through a lot of steps. I'm impressed that you took so many different methods to get to where you did. And the samples might not have been the hugest, or you might have run into some things, but I think with the dissertation, it's really the process that's important in the learning process, right? So
process.
It's the process. So I appreciate you doing those different methods and trying those different things to get to where you ended up getting. It might not have been perfect, but you probably learned a lot more.
Oh boy, did I.
Doing all those things. So I'm just going to want to take a kind of bigger picture kind of question with you in terms of what did you learn the most about developing this measure? What do you think you could have done better in given the kind of the perfect situation, and how might that have impacted your results?
So that's a big question, very broad.
Well, I said it was going to be a big picture question.
So I think for me, in terms of overarchingly around a measurement tool development, is it not easy. And I will say where the biggest, Brandy, can you ask your question again?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of go wherever you want to with it. I was just thinking about, of all the different methods that you used, either individually or kind of in combination to develop your measure and then, ultimately use it. What did you kind of overall learn about using those different methods that was helpful or useful, or a limitation in getting to where you're at?
And I will say and this goes back to one of your comments earlier about appraisal and informational support being dropped.
Yeah.
When I initially planned to do use quote unquote subject matter experts in assessing the content validity ratio, you think subject matter, you think experts. I'm like, oh, clinicians, they know a lot. They engage with people all the time. What I didn't do was also take that step back and say, yeah, but all of us engage in supportive behaviors, or we either provide them or receive them. And that perspective, when I was assessing content validity rate, the content validity ratio could have really been important, even for just retaining some of those items in those areas. So that was initially when I look at it, I'm like, that was a missed opportunity for getting a little bit more of that. And then, it would have been very helpful. The interviews then also could have been very helpful. I found AIM 2 to be probably the most challenging, really navigating, looking at these items and assessing validity and reliability. It is that, it's pretty straightforward in some regards, but I spend a lot of time really trying to conceptualize what measurement tools using, in accompaniment with the depth of support measure would be most beneficial. Why would they be the most beneficial? How should I look at these different forms of validity and reliability? And Brandy, I tell you, I spent a long time muddling through that. I think when I, initially did my oral exam, I thought I had it all really concretely figured out, that I'm going to do it this way. But then as I, took that step back and especially as things progress and with COVID and kind of reassessing the length of the, making some adjustments to the length of some of the surveys, being that they'd be done electronically. It just was, that is something that I did not think would take as much mental energy and time to really flesh out, which, people who do who do measurement tools as a hobby, there's, as I was looking, I'm like, oh yeah, some of these measurement tools are created by the same person, must really love it, but it is not easy to do.
Thanks, Rob.
Vithya, do you or Mike want to jump in?
I'll jump in. So Rob, I thought you did a great job, and I agree with Brandy, super ambitious, lots of different parts. So definitely hats off to you. I really appreciated how you said that the types of support might be related to the types of traumatic experiences that they've had. So I was really curious about the qualitative portion, those interviews that you conducted. And I know the sample was small, so I know that we can't make any sweeping generalizations, but was there anything that you found related to the type, because you did ask about an experience with a traumatic event, right? And so was there anything that you noticed or any common themes that you noticed about the type of trauma they experienced and then the type of support that was helpful or the person that was helpful?
So the types of traumatic and challenging situations that the 7 participants identified were actually very varied. So it ranged in everything from a cancer diagnosis to being robbed in a foreign country. So it was very coming out as one of the participants, one of her most traumatic experiences was coming out to her mom as a lesbian. And then in that particular situation, she relied on her grandmother for emotional support, and her grandmother gave her that belonging support and emotional support to make her feel like she could be herself. And that was, I think, a common, that the emotional support and with hints of that belonging support were the common thread in all of those. Being able to go to someone when I am feeling this strong sense of emotion, these overwhelming emotions, and being able to just get some of that support to know that it's going to be okay. I'm going to be able to make it through. There's also 2 of the folks that identified parental divorce as a traumatic experience. So this did not look, those interviews did not look specifically at community violence in order to leave it a little more broad for people to identify all of the different ways that support might manifest. So there was some good information, and with qualitative interviews, also some just general challenges and people opting in but not being the most engaged in the process. Which Brandy, to take it back to yours, that was also something that was fascinating, and I actually really enjoyed it. And I think that the challenge with that, Vithya, is that I'm a clinician, so I'm used to like digging and asking and probing and exploring, and I just had to sit back, ask the question, and provide some prompts or some additional questions in there. But I had to remove myself, and not an easy task, given some of the folks that I was interviewing, but still an enjoyable experience. It was to take it back, Brandy, to what you said, it was certainly a learning opportunity.
Definitely. And then kind of going back to Brandy's higher level question. So when you think about that specific part, that qualitative part, was there anything that you wish you did differently? Anything that you wish you had added in that part, especially now being at the end of this? Would you
I
have
wish-
focused more on community violence, maybe?
That was, so in the original set of questions, I did ask, in addition to just the general questions around traumatic or challenging experiences and then the support, I did have some questions around specifically community violence. I went back and forth about whether keeping it would be appropriate or it would be like a little leading to like be digging too much at specific types of trauma. In retrospect, I wish I would have kept it in, even if the information wasn't, it would have given me the opportunity to explore that data a little bit. Hindsight's always 20/20.
Yeah, of course.
I'm surprised, I'm going to be honest with y'all, given my disdain for research, which I probably shouldn't say in front of you all, but I will. I am surprised I really hung in there and learned as much as I did, which I guess is the whole point of this exercise of dissertating.
Yes.
Yes, that is the whole point.
I'm glad I got there. I learned.
Thank you, Rob.
So thank you, Rob. I had a question about the community violence piece as well. So you sort of answered it just now with the qualitative piece that that you didn't assess only for community-based violence. I'm curious about the rest of your sample in aims 2 and 3. Did you measure, did your sample experience community-based violence, or was it more of a sample that experienced these more traumatic, adverse life experiences and traumatic experiences?
So in aim 2, the original survey included a trauma inventory. My concern then became, because it was being administered electronically and I wouldn't, have much control over it, that inventory that I was using was quite lengthy, and it added a lot of additional questions. So that in the end just looked at in the validity and reliability testing, then that was dropped. And it also that aim did not include specific questions around trauma. So that was more looking at the mental health side and testing validity and reliability. In aim 3, we used the community experience questionnaire, which specifically looked at experiences with community violence. And holistically, I will say is that the sample did not experience the exposure to community violence for the sample was somewhat low, which might have had an impact on the final results as well. There just wasn't the variety in experiences that I had thought. And part of that is the sample. Part of that is, if I'm in a program to help me pursue my education and, go on to college, is that going to give me the same level of exposure as, the young people that I initially included from Covenant House, which is in North St. Louis City, predominantly Black African-American, with high levels of trauma from being homeless, living on the streets. So that probably, Mike, is a limitation that I should have included and didn't. But here we are now, continuing to learn.
Yeah, because you mentioned community-based violence a lot, yet your sample throughout the different phases doesn't really have people who have experienced community-based violence. So I think that's something that that you need to kind of address in the limitations. And it may impact your results. If you experience community-based violence, you often experience an injury. So you've been assaulted, you've been shot, you've been stabbed, so if I have a physical injury, I may need more instrumental kinds of practical kinds of support. And so, a person who's been injured in that way may react differently, because I know instrumental support didn't kind of load as high. And that may be different in a sample that experiences community-based violence. So I think that's something that you want to report in your limitations as well. And I want to turn to, and I mentioned this many times when I gave you feedback in your initial draft of your dissertation, around your procedures for thematic analysis in that 7 sample group. What are some of what type of thematic analysis did you conduct, and what were some of the procedures that you went through?
Yeah, so part of my rewrites was in draft 2 was to give a little bit more clarity on the process. So I did not, in terms of my qualitative interviews, do a structured analysis, and I think that probably in conversation should be included as one of the limitations as well. I was specifically looking at and just pulling out the types of support that individuals identified to support the initial items that were included in the measurement tool. Again, so it didn't go into that much of an analysis per se, more so just, I don't want to say surface level, but a little more of that surface level. What did individuals identify in that interview?
Okay. Because as I mentioned too, right, you have domain summaries, right, rather than themes. So themes kind of tell me something, whereas domain summaries are like, here are these categories, boom.
Yeah, and I did go back in and make some of those changes because you were spot on, Mike, because this is what you know.
Right. And so you might want to think about, there are other ways, there are other forms of thematic analysis too, right? So I mean, there's the reflexive form of thematic analysis that people talk a lot about, which is this kind of, really kind of developing this kind of rich set of themes. But there are other forms, there's coding reliability thematic analysis, there's code book thematic analysis that is more in line with what you've done here, which is, I'm not doing this kind of exploration. I'm really doing this like, okay, what people are saying loading onto these categories that I have already predefined. And so that might be a way, because when you write this up for articles and things like that, qualitative researchers are gonna ask these questions in that, because one thing we're sensitive to is kind of black box stuff, where it's like, hey, there's this data and here's the results, and I don't really want to talk about how I came up with those things. It was just magic. So you want to really kind of outline whether you choose to really claim thematic analysis. You want to outline, this is what I did. I read the transcripts 4 times. I did initial coding. I categorized. I did some cross stuff. I did reach. I feel like I did reach saturation because people started repeating things, or I didn't reach saturation because COVID screwed everything up. So I wasn't able to get full saturation, and kind of just name that too in your limitation section. I think is which you've begun to do, which I think is important as well. And the other thing you want to talk about too, this is also a question, is regarding trustworthiness. So when you analyze the data, did you engage in any trustworthiness kind of strategies to make sure that what you were seeing is actually what somebody else might see if they looked at the data?
No, another limitation.
Okay. So that's, you want to kind of name that too, around that piece too. So let's see. That's all I got.
So picking up a little bit on what Mike just said there, I think, at least the way I view the work that you did, this open-ended interviewing was a supplement. I don't consider, and I wouldn't have used the term themes. When you're developing a measure like this, you're really looking at their factors in a quantitative measure. When you invoke the term theme around people who are more qualitative, they're going to start thinking something differently. When all I think, or at least I read into what you were doing, is you're going through a multi-step process to learn as much as you could on specific factors that comprise this thing that people call social support, and that through this process, the belonging factor became pronounced. Again, because most of your analyses and results are of a quantitative kind of nature, you should use the term factor. rather than theme. And people don't do theme analysis when they develop measures. It's factor analysis. And the belonging construct or factor you're arguing is something important here, which also brings up the question of, did you look at the factor structure to take those items that you rationally derived through your process and say, does a belonging variable or factor, as taken apart from your depth of social support measure, possess any different relationships to your other variables? That's, of course, a very simple thing to do, just create another variable and look at that. I do think that, what you're doing with the belonging is interesting, and that's like a unique contribution here, particularly with marginalized populations, where that might be more pronounced than a mainstream population, where the informational instrumental factors, you would expect to see more action there. But the belonging with the marginalized factors, to me, is sort of a, like, quote unquote discovery here, and that then suggests that you should take those items that tap belonging and look at the empirical relationships between the belonging factor and these other external covariates, as out of your depth of support measure. So I recommend you do that as a part of a revision, and just to add a little bit there, to a little bit of flavor there, and not something that's would take a really long time, but just to analyze that belonging factor a little bit further. Your results on your incremental validity are actually quite impressive. I think you've downplaying those. The 4% increase is not unusual at all. I mean, it did reach significance and added for it's not irrelevant. And for the other dependent variables, you had very substantial incremental validity for your depth of support measure. That's quite substantial. What you might want to do is flip the order in your first analysis and put your depth of support measure into the regression first, and just say how much, in your own head, ask the question, how much incremental validity does the other measure capture over and above my depth of support measure in the regression equation? And that would, of course, reversing that would give you a little bit of insight on that. But it's really quite substantial. And I think everybody's right about the moderator, the interaction term, not being significant, probably partly due to the sample. And one interesting thing you can do is, out of the 150 people that you have, do you have a violence exposure kind of variable? And if so, maybe just select out those people and run the same analysis with that analytic sample and see what the moderating influence is on that more enriched community violence exposed group is. Maybe it's, let's just say you take out half the sample that represents a more, or take out those people that certainly are not had any exposure to community violence. And so you can replicate to some extent within your 150 a more community exposed violence, and then assess the interaction term, the same analysis that you did with the total. And run that just to see. And I know Brandy appreciates this, and probably others do too, that one shouldn't, apologize for getting null results.
You, you threw Brandy under the bus real fast there. What was that about?
No, it's not under
mean,
the bus.
It's you're
kidding.
trying to falsify these things. You're not trying to prove things.
Right.
You know,
Null results are just as important.
That is true.
yeah, I mean, this idea that, well, in research, at least my style of research, the perspective I take, I don't set out to prove things. To me, that's bad research. And so, but I do think you got a little bit more to analyze that you could probably do in like a couple hours.
Yep.
And I think it would, shed a little bit of light here on some things. But overall, developing a measure, this is very standard. You go through this process, multiple steps, sometimes multiple samples. And I really appreciated that. And I think your reliability and validity testing is pretty strong. Your incremental validity results are actually quite impressive.
Well, thank you all.
I was going to have the same suggestion as Mike with if you have, enough people that have experience of community violence, run it with that.
Yeah.
So that you can
or if you don't, you could remove, let's say, some that clearly don't, and then approximate the kind of sample that you want out of that 150, and then rerun your analyses.
Or any violence, I would say, even intimate partner
Any
violence,
violence.
any kind of experience of
Oh
violence.
yeah, anything that would smack of that variable at all.
Yeah.
So it might just be easier to eliminate, let's say 50 people or whatever. I just don't know. But I'm not saying it would change anything, but it would. You could call it, you could just simply write as a form of sensitivity analyses. I restricted a subsample based on this to approximate that, and maybe you find that still doesn't matter. But just adding a couple of those sentences adds greater validity to your overall analyses on that aim.
A lot of great feedback and some things to work on. But all, and I will say all good stuff to work on too, to flesh out and get a little bit more information that likely just already exists in the data and simple enough to unpack. And then
and I'm not suggesting you do any total revamps. These are just some little additional wrinkles with some data analysis that you can do in a few hours.